The cameras were operational 24/7 by week's end. Rachel had her documentation system running like a federal investigation, and Margaret was just beginning her campaign. But so were we. Margaret's next escalation occurred on a Tuesday morning, when I woke to the unmistakable smell of diesel fuel contaminating our well water. Rachel was already awake, standing in our kitchen holding a glass of what had been crystal-clear drinking water, now tinted with an oily rainbow that caught the morning light like a twisted prism. "Someone poisoned our well," she said, her federal, prosecutor voice cutting through the morning silence like a blade. By midday, we discovered the full extent of sabotage. Our propane lines had been accidentally damaged during what appeared to be landscaping work. The electrical cables to our solar array had been severed cleanly with what was definitely not landscaping equipment. And that diesel smell. Someone had dumped at least 6 gallons directly into our well housing. All this occurred during a 72-hour period when we'd been visiting Rachel's family in another city. No witnesses, no obvious evidence, just thousands in damage and the genuine possibility our water supply was ruined. But Margaret hadn't anticipated one thing. Those security cameras I'd installed were motion-activated and battery-powered. Even with our electricity cut, they continued recording. The footage was crystal clear. A contractor's truck, license plate perfectly visible, arriving at our property at 12:15 a.m. 2 individuals with flashlights systematically cutting our power lines. The same truck returning the following night, this time with fuel containers heading straight for our well. Rachel accessed the contractor registration database on her laptop. The truck belonged to Mountain View Services, a company registered to one Margaret Hoffman. "Well," Rachel said, scrolling through the business registration documents, "this just became a criminal case." Chapter 7. Federal involvement. Legal fact: environmental contamination of water supplies is a federal crime under the Safe Drinking Water Act, carrying penalties up to $45,000 per day, plus criminal charges. It doesn't matter if it's diesel fuel or if the contamination was accidental. Poisoning someone's water supply is serious federal business. Bill arrived within an hour of Rachel's call, bringing backup. When you've practiced law in a small town for 4 decades, you know people, like the county environmental inspector, state water quality specialist, and a very interested investigator from the EPA's Criminal Enforcement Division. By Thursday morning, our property resembled a crime scene investigation. Water samples, soil samples, photographic documentation, and enough federal agents to staff a small government office. The diesel contamination was confirmed, the source traced, and Margaret's contractor faced charges that could result in years of imprisonment. But Margaret wasn't retreating. If anything, the federal attention seemed to increase her desperation. That weekend, she called an emergency HOA meeting with the agenda item, a special assessment of $18,000 per property for critical infrastructure upgrades to prevent environmental hazards in the neighborhood. $18,000 per property, due within 45 days. The meeting took place in the community center, tension palpable the moment you entered. Folding chairs creaking under anxious residents, the smell of overcooked coffee from a pot sitting too long, and Margaret at the front with a presentation that would impress any high-pressure salesperson. "Recent events have demonstrated our critical need for infrastructure modernization," she announced to approximately 35 homeowners. "This assessment will ensure every property meets current safety standards." What she omitted was that most residents were on fixed incomes, retirees who'd purchased their homes specifically because they were affordable, people who couldn't write an $18,000 check without facing foreclosure. Elena, who operates the local cafe and has lived here for 18 years, raised her hand. "Margaret, I can't afford $18,000. None of us can. What happens if we can't pay?" Margaret's smile was pure predator. The HOA would be forced to place liens on non-compliant properties for community safety. That's when Bill stood up. At 75, he doesn't move quickly, but when he speaks, people listen. "Margaret, I've reviewed the HOA bylaws. This assessment requires a 2/3 majority vote of all property owners, not just those present. We don't have quorum for this kind of financial decision." Margaret's face cycled through several interesting color changes. "The board has emergency powers," she protested. "No," Bill interrupted. "The board has emergency powers for actual emergencies. Attempting to extort $18,000 from your neighbors isn't an emergency. It's racketeering." Chapter 8. The pattern emerges. The room fell silent except for fluorescent lights humming overhead. Rachel leaned over and whispered, "She's not just harassing us anymore, Marcus. She's running a protection racket." That's when I realized Margaret wasn't trying to force compliance with her rules. She was attempting to drive us all out so she could purchase our properties cheaply and sell them to developers. This wasn't about property values. This was about property theft. Margaret's response to Bill's legal challenge was immediate and vicious. Within 48 hours, she'd filed 4 separate police reports claiming I was threatening neighbors and stockpiling weapons at the homestead. The first welfare check happened Wednesday afternoon. 2 deputies knocked with the careful politeness officers use when they're uncertain if they're dealing with a genuine threat or a neighborhood troublemaker. "Sir, we've received reports of threatening behavior and possible weapons violations," Sergeant Rodriguez said, consulting his notepad. Anonymous caller expressed concern about a dangerous veteran in the area. I invited them in immediately. Nothing demonstrates innocence like opening your doors to law enforcement. They examined my adapted workshop, saw my woodworking tools, physical therapy equipment, and my collection of exactly 3 hunting rifles that were properly stored and registered. "This is embarrassing," Deputy Williams said after their inspection. "Whoever reported this either seriously misunderstands what constitutes a threat or they're deliberately wasting our time." The second welfare check came 4 days later. Different. Deputies, identical anonymous tip, same results. By the third check, the officers were openly irritated. "Mr. Coleman, we're documenting these calls as harassment," Sergeant Rodriguez told me. "Someone's using emergency services to intimidate you, and that's a crime." But Margaret wasn't finished with her campaign of lies. She had begun posting on social media vague warnings about dangerous individuals in the neighborhood and concerning activity at all hours. Never naming me directly, she wasn't quite that foolish, but making it obvious who she meant. Rachel screenshot every post, date, time, content, engagement metrics, building that pattern documentation like the federal prosecutor she was. Chapter 9. The Legal Trap. Then Margaret played her most despicable card. It arrived on a Friday because bullies love ruining weekends. A cease and desist letter from Hoffman Legal Services claiming I was harassing and intimidating Margaret, threatening criminal charges if I didn't stop my campaign of harassment against her. The letter specifically mentioned my disability benefits, suggesting they could be affected if criminal charges were filed. The threat was clear: back down, or lose the medical support that keeps me functional. Rachel read the letter, once set it down, and did something I'd only witnessed twice in our marriage. She smiled, not a happy smile, the kind of smile a predator makes right before it reminds you that you're in its territory. "Marcus, darling," she said, reaching for her phone. "Margaret just committed a federal crime. Legal fact, threatening to interfere with someone's disability benefits as retaliation violates the Americans with Disabilities Act and can result in federal civil rights charges. It's also considered witness intimidation if you're involved in legal proceedings, which we now were thanks to the EPA investigation. The timing was perfect for cosmic justice. This was Veterans Appreciation Week, and the local veterans group had planned a community barbecue at Elena's Cafe. When word spread about Margaret's threats against a disabled veteran, the response was immediate and overwhelming. Elena's Cafe became the unofficial headquarters for what Bill started calling Operation Community Watch. Coffee was always brewing. Maps were spread across tables showing property boundaries and legal rights, and veterans from 4 counties began arriving to offer support. "This isn't just about you anymore, Marcus," said Robert, a Vietnam veteran, who'd driven 3 hours to help. "This is about standing up to bullies who think they can push around people who've already sacrificed enough." Rachel was constructing her federal case like she was building a cathedral. Every piece of evidence carefully placed, every legal precedent researched and documented. 53 incidents over 20 months. 15 neighbors willing to testify about Margaret's pattern of harassment. 4 federal agencies now investigating various aspects of Margaret's behavior. In federal court, Rachel explained to the group gathered at Elena's, "We don't just prove individual crimes, we prove systematic civil rights violations. Margaret's not just harassing Marcus, she's targeting him specifically because of his disability status." The legal precedent was solid. Similar cases had resulted in settlements exceeding $75,000, plus injunctive relief and civil rights monitoring. Margaret was facing financial ruin and possible prison time. Margaret Hoffman never expected to find herself fumbling with illegally duplicated keys outside our front door at 1:30 a.m., unaware that my spouse was a federal attorney who had been anticipating this exact scenario for nearly 4 years. The metallic scraping echoed through the darkness as Margaret struggled with her unauthorized master key, her flashlight casting erratic beams across our windows like a desperate intruder. She whispered frantically about homeowner association authority and mandatory property assessments in the dead of night. Meanwhile, my partner Rachel was already dialing emergency services, her voice steady as steel. "This is federal attorney Rachel Coleman reporting an attempted break-in in progress. The perpetrator is unlawfully entering federal property." Margaret's panicked voice pierced the night air. "This is association business. I have legal authority to be here." Rachel's calm response, "Ma'am, you're committing federal crimes. Remain where you are. How would you react if your HOA leader attempted to break into your residence in the middle of the night? Share your thoughts in the comments, and let me know where you're following from. I'm curious how many of you have encountered power-hungry HOA officials. Let me rewind and explain how we reached this point, because this saga begins 4 years earlier with the scent of cedar and the rumble of my grandfather's vintage truck, climbing our dirt road for the final time. Chapter 2. The inheritance. I'm Marcus, a 35-year-old disabled Marine who inherited my grandfather's 45-acre homestead in what was once complete wilderness. The key phrase being "was once." When Grandpa purchased this land in 1986, the nearest resident lived 6 miles away. Now we're surrounded by identical suburban developments sprouting like mushrooms after rain. Somehow, our property became entangled in something called the Cedar Ridge Homeowners Association. My spouse Rachel specializes in federal civil rights prosecution. She's brilliant, tougher than boot leather, and has zero tolerance for intimidation tactics. We connected at a veterans medical center where she was investigating healthcare corruption, while I was learning to manage chronic injuries from an explosive device that restructured my back in ways never intended by nature. The homestead became our refuge. Grandpa had constructed it completely self-sufficient. Solar arrays humming softly in the dawn light, a deep well providing pure water from 250 feet below ground, propane systems that maintained that distinctive gas odor even when functioning properly. I installed accessibility modifications and transformed the workshop where I practice therapeutic woodworking. There's something about smooth walnut beneath your palms that silences the chaos in your mind. Then Margaret Hoffman relocated to our area. Margaret, 54 years old, works in property sales and patrols the neighborhood like she's conducting military reconnaissance. She arrived here 6 years ago from some urban subdivision and immediately determined our rural community required enhancement. Within 8 months, she had established the HOA through promises of preserving property values and enforcing community standards. What she actually intended was eliminating anyone who didn't conform to her suburban paradise vision. Her initial target, the solar panels Grandpa installed in 1994. Apparently, they were aesthetically offensive and reduced the neighborhood's visual appeal. Never mind, they predated her authority by over 2 decades. Next came objections to our industrial-grade propane tanks. Industrial grade? They're standard equipment for any rural property, but Margaret deemed them too commercial-looking. Chapter 3. The First Strike. The violation notice arrived on a Wednesday via certified mail because naturally it required official delivery. The postal vehicle rumbled up our drive like it carried a legal subpoena, which essentially it did. $1,500. Daily penalties, the document stated. until unsightly installations are removed from premises. 45 days for compliance. I retrieved Grandpa's property deed and all grandfather clause documentation. Everything was legitimate, properly recorded. I drove straight to Margaret's downtown office, assuming this was simply a misunderstanding. Grandfather, clauses don't cover recent installations, she declared without lifting her eyes from her monitor. These modifications lack approval from the current HOA board. Ma'am, those panels were installed 29 years ago. Your HOA has existed for 8 months. That's when she looked up, and I witnessed something in her expression that chilled my blood. It wasn't confusion or mere obstinacy. It was cold calculation. Property standards affect everyone's investments, Mr. Coleman. I assumed a veteran, like yourself, would understand the importance of compliance. The way she pronounced veteran, like something unpleasant she needed to scrape from her shoe. That moment revealed this wasn't about solar installations or propane equipment. This was about her deciding who deserved to live in her neighborhood, and who didn't. Rachel was in her study reviewing case files when I returned. I handed her the violation notice and watched her knuckles whiten as she gripped the paper. "Marcus," she said, her prosecutor voice emerging, "I believe Margaret Hoffman just committed a very costly mistake." Chapter 4. Escalation. Margaret's next move arrived exactly 10 days later. Another certified letter, another postal truck grinding up our driveway. This envelope was substantially thicker. "Mandatory interior inspection notice," screamed from the page in bold capitals. According to Margaret's correspondence, an anonymous resident had reported potential health and safety violations inside our cabin. The HOA demanded comprehensive interior access within 96 hours or face $8,000 daily penalties. Rachel read the document twice, then set it aside with the precise care she reserved for handling federal evidence. "Marcus, this constitutes a Fourth Amendment violation in waiting," she explained. "HOA authority covers exterior property usage, not interior spaces. She has absolutely no legal right to enter our home, but intimidators rely on victims not understanding their rights." I spent the following day examining every page of the original HOA charter documents, all 52 pages of mind-numbing legal terminology that would challenge a tax specialist. My discovery? Absolutely nothing regarding interior inspections. The HOA's jurisdiction ended at our threshold. Legal fact: most HOA charters only address exterior modifications and shared area usage. They cannot legally demand home entry without court orders or genuine emergencies. Always examine your actual charter documents, not just their threatening correspondence. Our neighbor Bill visited that evening. Bill, 75, practiced law for 4 decades and possesses the kind of institutional memory that makes people like Margaret nervous. He was enjoying coffee on our porch when he shared this revelation. "You know, Marcus, Margaret attempted this identical tactic with the Wilson family last year. They became so exhausted fighting her, they sold their home for $25,000 below market value. Interesting detail, Margaret's real estate firm handled that sale." The aroma of Bill's strong coffee mixed with evening pine as that information registered. This wasn't about property values or community standards. This was systematic harassment designed to force residents out so Margaret could profit from the turmoil. Chapter 5. False alarms and federal interest. Margaret's harassment escalated dramatically. 2 days after the inspection deadline passed, with us politely refusing her demand to search our personal belongings, she deployed her next strategy. At 6:23 a.m. on a Saturday, 4 fire trucks roared up our driveway, sirens screaming, emergency, lights flashing like we were hosting an apocalyptic light show. "Report of propane leak," the fire captain explained as I emerged in my robe. Immediate threat to surrounding properties. 25 minutes and thorough inspection later, the verdict was clear. No leak, equipment in perfect condition, everything meeting code standards. But here's the catch: the emergency response fee for false alarms, $400 charged directly to us. "Well," Margaret said when the captain called her with the all clear, "it could have been dangerous. Better cautious than sorry." The captain's expression revealed everything about how frequently Margaret had made false emergency reports in this neighborhood. That evening, Rachel worked at our kitchen table, surrounded by legal documents and a notepad covered in her meticulous handwriting. "What are you working on?" I asked. "Establishing a pattern," she replied without looking up. "Every interaction, every false claim, every financial penalty she's imposed on you and likely others." Key insight. Harassment isn't just individual incidents. It's demonstrating intentional, systematic behavior designed to interfere with civil rights. She showed me her documentation. Dates, times, amounts, witnesses. 3 weeks of records that painted a clear picture of escalating intimidation. "In federal court, pattern evidence is everything," Rachel explained. "1 incident is misunderstanding. 3 incidents might be coincidence. But documented harassment, campaigns targeting disabled veterans, that's when the Justice Department takes notice." Chapter 6. Building the case. I began installing security cameras the next day, basic home security equipment covering our property perimeter. In our state, you can record anything visible from your own property without consent. I had a strong feeling we'd need every frame of footage. Bill stopped by while I mounted the final camera near the workshop. "Smart decision," he said, handing me a wrench. "Margaret doesn't realize it yet, but she's about to star in her own documentary about HOA abuse." But Rachel's strategy was more elegant than just winning in court. She was giving Margaret enough rope to hang herself completely. "The beauty of dealing with narcissistic bullies," Rachel said, stirring sugar into her coffee, "is that they can't help escalating. Margaret's frustration is going to make her do something spectacularly stupid. We didn't have to wait long." Chapter 10. The social media meltdown. That night, Margaret made a post on the neighborhood social media page that would have made her lawyer weep if she'd been smart enough to hire one. "Some people don't belong in decent neighborhoods. They bring violence and chaos wherever they go. Time to take direct action." The post was screenshot by 8 different neighbors before Margaret deleted it. But on the internet, nothing ever truly disappears. Rachel printed it and added it to her evidence file. "Direct action," she said, highlighting Margaret's words. "That sounds like a threat to me." Bill's discovery came at 3:22 a.m. on a Tuesday, delivered via email with a subject line that made my phone buzz me awake. "You need to see this immediately." The attachment was a scanned document from 1986, the original Cedar Ridge HOA formation paperwork that Bill had excavated from the county records archive. Most of it was standard legal boilerplate, but buried on page 31 was a clause that changed everything. Emergency access provisions require formal court order except in cases of immediate life-threatening danger, as determined by licensed emergency personnel. Let me translate that from legal language. Margaret's master key, the one she'd been threatening to use for inspections, she had no legal right to it whatsoever. The HOA board couldn't just decide to walk into people's homes. They needed a judge's signature, period. But that wasn't even the best part. Rachel had been conducting her own investigation into Margaret's finances, and what she found made the water contamination look like jaywalking. Margaret wasn't just embezzling HOA funds. She was operating a sophisticated property manipulation scheme that would have impressed organized crime. The money trail was beautiful in its criminal simplicity. HOA fees collected from residents were being funneled into shell companies controlled by Margaret. Those companies would then purchase properties from homeowners who'd been harassed into selling below market value. The properties were flipped to developers for massive profits, with Margaret pocketing the difference. Total unreported income over 4 years, $420,000. "The IRS is going to be very interested in this," Rachel said, highlighting numbers on her laptop screen. "Tax evasion on this scale isn't just civil penalties, it's federal prison time." Chapter 11. The web tightens. Margaret was in deeper trouble than just tax fraud. Rachel's forensic accounting revealed that Margaret was leveraged beyond her means in real estate investments. She owed $420,000 to various lenders, and her development partner was demanding payment on a 90-day deadline. Translation: Margaret needed 6 more forced property sales to avoid bankruptcy. That's when the second bombshell Bill had been having coffee with Harold at the hardware store, the kind of small-town conversation that happens over the smell of motor oil and metal shavings, when Harold mentioned something interesting. "That Hoffman woman's been in here 4 times asking about getting keys copied," Harold said. "Last time she brought in a ring of about 15 keys, said they were for HOA maintenance access. I told her I couldn't copy keys without written authorization from property owners." But Margaret hadn't given up. She'd found another hardware store 3 towns over, one where nobody knew her face or cared about proper authorization. She'd walked, out with copies of 15 different house keys, including one that looked suspiciously like our front door lock. She told the kid behind the counter they were for emergency HOA maintenance, Harold reported. Paid cash, no questions asked. Rachel's response was swift and strategic. "Perfect, now we have premeditation." For the next 72 hours, Margaret conducted surveillance on our property, like she was planning a military operation. Our security cameras caught her driving by every few hours, always at different times, always slowing down to study our routine. She was learning our patterns, looking for the perfect moment to strike. The smell of her car's exhaust would linger in our driveway after each pass. That distinct burnt oil scent of a vehicle needing maintenance but being driven hard anyway. Desperation has a smell, and Margaret reeked of it. Tuesday night she made her first test run. At 12:23 a.m. our motion sensors detected her approaching the cabin on foot, flashlight in hand, moving through the trees like some kind of suburban commando. She got within 15 feet of our front door before our neighbor Bill's porch light came on and she retreated. "She's practicing," Rachel observed, reviewing the footage. "Testing our response times, checking our security coverage. She'll be back." Chapter 12. The final confrontation Thursday evening brought the real attempt. Margaret arrived at 1:47 a.m. in her car, engine running, headlights off. She approached our cabin with a flashlight, crowbar, and her illegally copied keyring. The sound of metal scraping against metal echoed through the night air as she tried key after key in our front door lock. But here's the beautiful part. Marcus had changed the locks 4 days earlier, right after Harold's warning call. Margaret's copied keys were useless pieces of metal that fit nothing. Plot twist. Instead of retreating when the keys failed, Margaret's desperation drove her to attempt window entry. She used the crowbar to try prying open our bathroom window, then moved to the bedroom window, making enough noise to wake half the county. That's when Rachel made the call that would end Margaret's criminal career. 1. What's your emergency? This is Federal Attorney Rachel Coleman at 52 Cedar Ridge Road. I'm reporting a breaking and entering in progress. The suspect is attempting to enter my home using burglary tools. I need immediate law enforcement response. Ma'am, are you in immediate danger? Negative. I'm armed, I'm trained, and I have the suspect under visual surveillance, but I need county, sheriff, state police, and federal agents en route immediately. This is related to an ongoing federal investigation. The calm authority in Rachel's voice was beautiful. No panic, no fear, just a federal prosecutor doing her job. Margaret, meanwhile, was having a complete breakdown outside our window. Her flashlight beam was erratic, bouncing off trees and walls like a disco ball operated by someone having a seizure. She was muttering to herself about HOA rights and property inspections while attempting to commit multiple felonies. Our security system captured every word, every action, every moment of her criminal enterprise in action. 7 different camera angles, perfect audio quality, motion-activated lighting that illuminated her face clearly enough for identification. Bill was positioned 300 feet away with his own camera, documenting everything from a safe distance. Elena was in her car at the end of our driveway, ready to block any escape route. 4 other neighbors were recording from their properties, ensuring multiple witness perspectives. When the first sheriff's deputy arrived, sirens off, lights off, professional stealth approach, Margaret was still trying to pry open our kitchen window. She was so focused on her breaking and entering project that she didn't notice law enforcement surrounding her until Deputy Martinez announced his presence. "Ma'am, step away from the window and place your hands where I can see them." Margaret's response was pure panic and entitlement. This is HOA business. I have every right to inspect this property. These people are violating community standards. Ma'am, you're trespassing on private property with burglary tools. You're under arrest. The sound of handcuffs clicking shut in the pre-dawn darkness was the most satisfying sound I'd heard in 4 years. But Margaret wasn't finished incriminating herself. As Deputy Martinez read her rights, she kept talking, providing a complete confession without being asked a single question. I'm the HOA president. I have master keys. These people don't belong in this neighborhood. Someone has to protect property values. Every word was recorded. Every statement was witnessed. Every confession was admissible in federal court. Margaret Hoffman had just talked herself into a federal prison sentence while providing the prosecution with everything they needed to convict her on every charge. Chapter 13. The community meeting, the emergency HOA meeting, was called for 7 p.m. Thursday, exactly 48 hours after Margaret's arrest made the front page of 4 local newspapers. The community center had never seen anything like it. 175 residents packed into a space designed for 60, with local TV crews setting up cameras and reporters checking their microphones like they were covering a presidential election. The smell of nervous sweat mixed with burnt coffee from the ancient percolator in the corner, while folding chairs creaked under the weight of a community that had finally reached its breaking point. Channel 9 News had positioned cameras at 4 angles. The local newspaper had sent their investigative reporter. Someone was even live streaming to social media for neighbors who couldn't fit inside. Margaret arrived 30 minutes late, having posted $75,000 bail with assets that were about to be frozen by federal seizure warrants. She looked like she'd been hit by a truck, disheveled hair, clothes that screamed, "I got dressed in a jail cell," and the kind of wild-eyed desperation that makes people cross to the other side of the street. Her public defender, a tired-looking man in a wrinkled suit, kept whispering urgent advice that Margaret was clearly ignoring. Smart lawyers know when to keep their clients quiet. Margaret, apparently, had never met a microphone she couldn't incriminate herself with. Bill called the meeting to order with the kind of authority that comes from 4 decades of legal practice. We're here to address the systematic harassment, criminal behavior, and financial fraud that has been perpetrated against this community by its former HOA president. The word former hit Margaret like a physical blow. She shot to her feet, pointing an accusatory finger at the crowd. You people have no idea what I've done for this neighborhood. I've protected property values. I've maintained standards. You've committed multiple federal crimes, Rachel interrupted, rising from her seat with a folder thick enough to choke a horse. Her federal prosecutor voice cut through the room like a sword through butter. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm federal attorney Rachel Coleman, and I'm here in my official capacity to inform this community about the criminal enterprise that has been operating under the guise of HOA governance. The room went dead silent except for the whir of camera equipment and the scratch of reporters' pens. Rachel opened her folder with theatrical precision. Mrs. Hoffman stands accused of violating the civil rights of disabled veterans under federal hate crime statutes. She faces environmental destruction charges for poisoning our water supply. She's been indicted for tax evasion, embezzlement, and racketeering. Each charge hit Margaret like a physical blow. Her face cycled through several interesting color changes, while her lawyer looked like he was calculating how fast he could escape through the nearest exit. The evidence includes 156 hours of security footage, 53 documented incidents of harassment, recorded confessions to multiple crimes, and financial records showing $420,000 in unreported income from property manipulation schemes. Elena stood up from the back of the room, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd fed half the town for 18 years. Margaret, you tried to steal our homes. You poisoned our neighbor's water. You threatened a disabled veteran who served our country. The crowd's anger was palpable, a low rumble of voices that grew louder with each revelation. But Margaret, in her infinite wisdom, decided this was the perfect moment for her final public meltdown. He doesn't belong in this neighborhood, she screamed, pointing directly at me. None of them do. This is supposed to be for decent people, not welfare cases and freeloaders who bring down property values. The silence that followed was deafening. You could have heard a pin drop on the industrial carpet. Rachel smiled that predator smile again and pulled out her phone. Ladies and gentlemen, Mrs. Hoffman has just provided on camera, in front of 175 witnesses, a perfect confession to federal hate crimes based on disability discrimination. She looked directly at Margaret with the kind of professional satisfaction that federal prosecutors live for. That statement will be Exhibit A in your hate crime trial, Mrs. Hoffman. Disability-based harassment carries a mandatory minimum of 12 years in federal prison. Margaret's complete breakdown was immediate and spectacular. She started screaming about conspiracies, about how everyone was against her, about how she was just trying to protect the neighborhood from undesirable elements. Every word was recorded. Every rant was witnessed. Every confession was admissible in federal court. Deputy Martinez, who'd been standing quietly by the door, stepped forward with a second set of handcuffs. Mrs. Hoffman, you're under arrest for violation of your restraining order, making terroristic threats and additional civil rights violations. As they led her away in handcuffs, Margaret's final words to the community were a masterpiece of self-incrimination. You'll all regret this when your property values crash because of these people. The room erupted in applause that could probably be heard 4 blocks away. Rachel closed her folder with satisfaction. Justice isn't always swift, but it's always thorough. Chapter 14. Justice served. 6 years in federal prison. $275,000 in restitution. Permanent registration as a civil rights violator. Margaret's fate was sealed by her own words, captured on camera, witnessed by 175 neighbors, and broadcast on 4 local news stations. But the real victory wasn't Margaret's downfall. It was what our community built from the ashes of her corruption. The HOA was dissolved by emergency vote that same night, replaced by a voluntary neighborhood association focused on mutual aid instead of mutual destruction. Bill was elected president unanimously, and his first official act was establishing a victim assistance fund using Margaret's seized assets. Property values? They actually increased. Turns out when national news covers your community's successful fight against corruption, people want to live there. Who knew that standing up to bullies was good for real estate? Elena expanded her cafe into an official community center with meeting rooms, legal aid services, and a coffee pot that never runs empty. The smell of fresh brewed coffee and Elena's famous apple pie has become the unofficial scent of neighborhood democracy. Marcus's transformation was the most beautiful part of the whole story. The woodworking therapy program that started in our adapted workshop has grown into the Cedar Ridge Veterans Workshop, a full-scale operation that helps disabled veterans across 4 counties learn new skills, process trauma, and build community. Rachel and I are stronger than ever. Shared trauma either breaks relationships or forges them into something unbreakable. Turns out fighting federal crimes together is excellent marriage therapy. Rachel's work on our case led to her promotion as head of a new federal task force focused on community harassment and civil rights violations. The social justice initiative that grew from our fight has exceeded every expectation. The Cedar Ridge Veteran Scholarship Fund, funded entirely by Margaret's seized assets, has sent 18 veterans to college in the past 4 years. The legal clinic that Bill and Rachel established provides free representation for harassment victims across the state. Chapter 15. The Legacy Final Legal Insight. Document everything. Build community alliances, and never underestimate the power of letting bullies expose themselves completely. Federal prosecutors love cases where the defendant provides their own evidence. 2 years later, our community barbecue at the homestead draws over 300 people. Veterans, legal professionals, neighbors, and families gather to celebrate what happens when good people refuse to be intimidated by petty tyrants. The sound of children laughing mingles with adults sharing stories of victory over corruption. Marcus stands at his workshop demonstrating woodworking techniques to a group of young veterans, while the smell of grilling burgers drifts across the property. His chronic pain hasn't disappeared, but his purpose has been renewed. From isolated victim to community leader, that's the kind of transformation that makes federal prosecutors believe in justice. The legal precedent from our case has been cited in 23 similar prosecutions across the country. Margaret's name has become a cautionary tale in legal circles, while Marcus's has become an inspiration. 5 other HOA corruption schemes have been exposed following media coverage of our story. Bill, now 79, still practices law part-time, specializing in cases where big institutions try to crush little people. Experience beats youth every time, he says, especially when experience has good documentation. Rachel's federal task force has investigated 31 cases of systematic community harassment, resulting in 47 convictions and over $3.2 million in restitution for victims. The Hoffman case taught us that individual harassment often hides systematic criminal enterprise, she explains to law enforcement training seminars. As the sun sets over our homestead, casting long shadows across the property that Margaret tried so hard to steal, I'm reminded that home isn't just where you live. It's where you're safe to heal, surrounded by people who understand that justice delayed is not justice denied. Our neighboring county recently asked for help with a similar situation, an HOA president targeting elderly residents with financial harassment. Rachel's task force is already investigating, and the Cedar Ridge Veterans Workshop is ready to provide support. The fight for justice never really ends, but that's acceptable. We've learned that standing up to bullies isn't just about winning, it's about building something better in their place. Share your worst HOA horror story in the comments below. We read every single one, and Rachel's task force investigates those that show criminal patterns. Hit that subscribe button for more stories of underdogs defeating corrupt systems, because sometimes justice wears handcuffs and speaks with a federal prosecutor's voice. Links in the description provide free legal resources, veteran support organizations, and information about reporting civil rights violations. Remember, you're never as powerless as bullies want you to believe. Epilogue. 3 years later, the morning sun filters through the cedar trees as I work in the shop, the familiar scent of sawdust mixing with pine. A young Marine veteran named David is learning to shape wood with hands that shake from service-connected injuries. He's one of 43 veterans who found healing through our program. This helps, he says quietly, running his palm across smooth oak. The noise in my head gets quieter. I understand completely. There's something magical about creating beauty from raw materials when the world has shown you too much destruction. Rachel arrives home from another successful prosecution, an HOA president in the next state who thought he could intimidate immigrant families. He thought wrong. Federal hate crime charges have a way of changing people's perspectives on the importance of civil rights. Our community has become a model for others facing similar corruption. Delegations visit monthly to learn how ordinary people can defeat systematic abuse through documentation, organization, and refusing to be intimidated. The homestead that Margaret tried to steal now hosts workshops on legal rights, community organizing, and veteran support. What she meant for harm, we transformed into healing. Elena stops by with fresh coffee and news that another corrupted HOA 3 counties over has been dissolved after residents used our playbook. The domino effect continues spreading, one community at a time. Bill, now 82, still takes calls from people facing harassment. His advice remains consistent. Document everything, know your rights, and remember that bullies rely on isolation. Build community, and you build strength. The legal precedent from our case appears in law school textbooks now. Students study how systematic harassment escalates into federal crimes and how proper documentation can build unbeatable cases. Margaret serves her sentence in federal prison, her property empire dissolved, her victims compensated. She discovered that actions have consequences, even when you think you're untouchable. But this story isn't really about Margaret's downfall. It's about what communities can accomplish when they refuse to be divided and conquered. It's about disabled veterans who deserve respect, not harassment. It's about federal prosecutors who believe in justice over convenience. It's about neighbors who choose solidarity over silence. Most importantly, it's about the truth that bullies fear most. When good people stop being afraid and start organizing, corruption crumbles. The workshop smells like cedar and coffee now, not fear and diesel fuel. Children play where Margaret once prowled. Veterans heal where she tried to harm. Justice isn't always swift, but when it comes, it's complete. And our front door? It's always open to those who need sanctuary, support, or simply want to learn that home is wherever people choose to stand together against those who would tear communities apart. The cameras still roll, the documentation continues, and the fight for justice never truly ends. But neither does the community we've built to wage it. Margaret Hoffman learned too late that some battles you simply cannot win, especially when you're fighting against people who've already lost too much to lose anything more. The cedar trees. Remember everything, and so do we. Chapter 16. The Ripple Effect 6. Months after Margaret's sentencing, I received a call that would change everything. The voice on the other end was shaky, barely above a whisper. Is this Marcus Coleman, the veteran who fought the HOA? Her name was Patricia Nguyen, a 67-year-old widow living 3 states away. Her HOA president, a man named Kenneth Blackwood, had been systematically targeting elderly residents, forcing them into foreclosure through manufactured violations and excessive fines. He's using your case as a blueprint, Patricia explained, her voice breaking, but in reverse. He studied what Margaret Hoffman did wrong, and he's being more careful, more cruel. Rachel was in her home office when I shared Patricia's story. She looked up from her laptop, that familiar prosecutorial spark igniting in her eyes. Get her on video call, Rachel said. If someone's weaponizing our case to perfect their own corruption, we need to understand their methodology. Patricia's story unfolded over the next 2 hours like a masterclass in evolved HOA tyranny. Kenneth Blackwood had learned from Margaret's mistakes. He documented everything meticulously, creating paper trails that appeared legitimate. He hired actual lawyers instead of relying on intimidation. He targeted the most vulnerable residents. Elderly people without family support, immigrants unfamiliar with the legal system, disabled individuals who couldn't easily fight back. But Kenneth had made one critical error in his research. He assumed our victory was about superior legal representation and federal connections. He completely missed the real foundation of our success: community organization and mutual support. Patricia, Rachel said, leaning toward the camera. How many neighbors has Kenneth targeted? 17 families in the past 2 years, Patricia replied. Most have already sold and moved away. The rest of us are too scared to speak up. Wrong, Rachel said firmly. You just did speak up. And now you're not alone. Within 48 hours, Rachel had assembled what she called the Community Defense Network, a coalition of attorneys, veterans advocates, civil rights organizations, and community organizers. Our little fight in Cedar Ridge had evolved into something much larger. The first team arrived in Patricia's neighborhood the following week. Bill, despite being 82, insisted on coming along. This is what we trained for, he said, packing legal documents into his worn briefcase. Margaret was practice. This is the real war. Elena coordinated logistics from her cafe, which had become the unofficial headquarters for what media outlets were now calling the anti-HOA Underground Railroad. Veterans from across the region volunteered to provide security and witness documentation. Law students offered free research assistance. Even Margaret's former neighbors contributed to a legal defense fund. Kenneth Blackwood's first mistake was underestimating the network effect. When our team arrived in Patricia's neighborhood, they found a community that had been isolated and terrorized into silence. Within a week, that same community had security cameras, legal representation, and a communication system that would make intelligence agencies jealous. Kenneth's second mistake was continuing his harassment campaign after being warned that federal investigators were monitoring the situation. Narcissistic bullies rarely learn from others' mistakes because they believe they're uniquely clever. His third and fatal mistake was targeting Maria Santos, an 89-year-old former federal judge who'd retired to the community 5 years earlier. Kenneth apparently didn't research his victims as thoroughly as he thought. When Kenneth served Judge Santos with a violation notice for unauthorized decorative elements. She had planted roses in her front yard. He had unknowingly declared war on someone with 40 years of federal bench experience and a network of connections that spanned 3 federal circuits. "Young man," Judge Santos told Kenneth during what he thought would be an intimidation meeting, "I've been interpreting constitutional law since before you were born. Would you like to discuss the Fourth Amendment implications of your inspection policies?" The recording of that conversation, Patricia had learned to document everything, became evidence in what would eventually be a federal civil rights case spanning 3 states and involving 14 HOA communities. Chapter 17. The network expands Kenneth's. Operation was more sophisticated than Margaret's, but sophistication without wisdom is just elaborate stupidity. He had created a network of 3 interconnected HOA communities, all managed by his company, Blackwood Community Services. Residents who complained in one community would find themselves facing violations in all 3. Families who tried to sell and escape would discover that properties in all 3 communities had been mysteriously devalued through selective enforcement actions. It was elegant, systematic, and completely illegal under federal racketeering statutes. Rachel's task force had grown into something resembling a federal agency. 12 full-time investigators, partnerships with 6 law schools providing research support, and a database tracking HOA abuse cases across 14 states. The Hoffman case taught us that individual harassment often masks systematic criminal enterprise, Rachel explained to a congressional subcommittee investigating HOA abuse. But the Blackwood Network shows us something more concerning: the evolution of these schemes into sophisticated criminal organizations. The hearing room was packed with victims, advocates, and reporters. Kenneth Blackwood himself attended, accompanied by 3 lawyers who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. His confidence was remarkable for someone facing potential federal charges. Congressman Rodriguez, chair of the subcommittee, reviewed a thick folder of documents. "Mr. Blackwood, these records show 17 elderly residents forced from their homes through manufactured violations. How do you explain this pattern?" Kenneth's response was smooth, practiced. "Congressman, HOA governance requires difficult decisions. Property values must be protected. Standards must be maintained. Some residents unfortunately cannot adapt to community expectations." Judge Santos, testifying as a witness, fixed Kenneth with the stare that had intimidated federal prosecutors for 4 decades. "Mr. Blackwood, in my 40 years on the federal bench, I've seen many criminals attempt to disguise their motives with bureaucratic language. Your difficult decisions constitute systematic targeting of protected classes under federal civil rights law. The beautiful thing about federal investigations is their thoroughness." While Kenneth focused on defending his individual actions, FBI forensic accountants were tracing money flows through his network of shell companies. What they found was breathtaking in its criminal complexity.